There were 6 young boys, soldiers, that'd been killed on the front line, and they were being brought to church, and their families were celebrating their lives. And then everyone got down on their knees as they carried the coffins into the church, and that's everyday life. That's just another morning in Kiev.
Could Ukraine's success or failure now determine not just the outcome of the war, but the future shape of Western security cooperation itself?
Hi, and welcome to the International Risk Podcast. And today, I'm joined by one of our international relations specialists, Katerina Mazzucchelli. She's joining me for a conversation about hybrid warfare and Russia's attacks in Ukraine. Welcome, Katerina.
Thank you, Dominic. Welcome to the International Risk Podcast yourself. It's a little bit strange being on this side of the microphone and I suppose hitting you with the hard questions today. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it, and thank you for this really unique opportunity.
I think it'll be fun. And where are you today, Katerina?
I'm currently in London, and you are joining us today live from Ukraine.
Yeah, that's right. I'm in Kiev today, which is a real blessing. It's great to be here.
Before we dive in, would you be able to give us an overview of the work you've been doing in Ukraine for the past week?
For sure. I've been here for about a week, and I've been working with different European companies and agencies that are having various meetings here. There's a lot of attention on Ukraine, and rightly so. The situation in Ukraine is, as everyone I think at some level understands, is very serious. But meeting with different government actors and meeting with different corporate actors and entrepreneurs in Ukraine has just been such a powerful week, and I can't help but think about this morning. We're staying at a nice hotel, which we need to because of the security situation. It's got the underground bunkers that invariably we sleep in most nights because of the air raid attacks. We'll probably discuss that. And the people we're meeting are doing a fantastic job in so many different areas. And it's amazing. Ukraine's been at war with Russia since 2014, and the full-scale invasion started in 2022. Obviously, now we're in late 2025, but this is still the largest. The last couple of days, we've seen the largest drone and missile attacks since the war began. And noting that drones are a new technology, I think we can say that the last couple of days in Kiev have seen the largest drone attacks in history. And it's a combination of drone and missile attacks, and it continues to attack civilian infrastructure. There were 6 civilians killed in Kiev, not far from here. Overnight, we had 2 children killed. It's just inexcusable. And if I sound a little bit passionate this morning, I definitely am, and we can maybe go into why a little bit later. But widespread damage to infrastructure, power outages, civilian casualties. We're talking about 400, 500 drones, 28 missiles. Now, they largely were targeting Kiev, but also cities like Odessa, Zaporizhzhia, Lviv, Chernihiv, Kharkiv. There's been power cuts across the country, including in Kiev. Many people injured, and the Ukrainian Air Force is doing an amazing job trying to keep those drones away from critical infrastructure. But of course, when Russia's launching 400 to 500 drones plus 20 to 30 ballistic missiles, some of them are going to get through and they are going to hit some of the civilian infrastructure. And, that's what we saw overnight. The reason I mentioned the hotel before was because it's quite important to understand that when foreigners like me come and work in Ukraine, whether we're visiting Odessa or Zaporizhzhia or Kiev or Lviv, we're staying in hotels. We don't have permanent residency here, but the hotels have set up bunkers. The hotel I'm staying at, the bunker's two levels below, and it's solid and there's beds and it's set up for this sort of an environment. But if you're a resident in Kiev or Lviv or one of the big cities, you don't necessarily have that. It means you've got to get up at 2:00 in the morning and then move to a shelter. Now, depending on what the alert is it a MiG taking off near the border? Is it a ballistic missile coming? Is it a swarm of drone attacks? You often don't know. And as was the case last night, there were 3 separate alarms. The first one normally goes off not long after you go to sleep. So around midnight, normally the first wave of drones or missiles comes. Then it's cleared maybe by about 1:00. Then about 2 or 3, the second wave comes. So that means every time you're either going down to the bomb shelter or you're leaving your house. Now, if you're staying at a hotel, okay, it's not that inconvenient. You've got to go up and down some stairs. It's still tiring, but it's doable. And especially if you're only here for a couple of weeks, you can survive on interrupted sleep. But if you live here, this is your life, then it's a different situation. I had dinner last night with someone that works for a big multinational tech firm that still has presence in Ukraine. And he was talking about, it was just that personal way that he was telling over the dinner table. He was talking about the sound of a missile. He goes, drones are annoying, they're scary, the explosions are scary. But he goes, the sound of a missile coming close to your apartment is just send a shiver down your spine. And I looked at his arms. He was in a short sleeve shirt, and he looked at his arms, and you could see him get goosebumps as he was describing the sound of the missile. And it's just, it really is tragic. It really is tragic. Everyday life is impacted by this. I was going to a meeting this morning, and there was some sound. It was clearly sounds from a church, some hymns, some praying, and people standing around. And so I walked over to see what was going on. There was about 100 or 200 people standing around, and you could see that it was a solemn occasion. You could see that it was serious. And then it was the worst thing. There's civilians, there's women, there's kids, there's old people, and you could see in the distance. And I just went, fuck. And you could see it. They were hearses. And it wasn't one hearse. There were 6 of them. There were 6 young boys, soldiers that'd been killed on the front line, and they were being brought to church, and their families were celebrating their lives. And then everyone got down on their knees as they carried the coffins into the church. And that's everyday life. That's just another morning in Kiev. 6 young boys being brought to church and just watching their families. But then the whole street, as I said, a couple of hundred people, everyone there just got down on their knees as they carried the coffins in. And it's just a very surreal, and that's life. And Ukraine did nothing wrong. Ukraine did nothing to deserve these attacks. And this is what the civilians are dealing with every single day.
That's incredibly powerful to hear, Dominic. Do you feel that the media is managing to accurately portray how devastating and intense daily life must be in Ukraine? Unfortunately, we have seen the proliferation of the term Ukraine fatigue.
Yeah, I think we've all been desensitized to it, and it's hard, and it's not to criticize the media. As you know, I travel quite a lot, and one of the reasons is because there is just nothing that can replace a face-to-face meeting. We're all really good at using Teams right now and using Zoom and Google Meets to interact online, but nothing replaces a face-to-face meeting. That's why I travel and meet a lot of my clients face-to-face. That's why so many government actors and corporate entities are traveling to Ukraine to meet with their local partners, to understand the situation and to see how they can better support. And nowadays, it's not even about supporting Ukraine; it's about partnering. The technology, skills, and capabilities of Ukrainians is absolutely phenomenal today, and just nothing can replace that. So the media has a tough job, but that is the media's job to make sure that those of us sitting in London and Copenhagen and Oslo and Stockholm can really understand what it's like in Ukraine. And it's not an easy story to tell, but I think it needs to be told, because if it doesn't get told and if people don't understand the real threats, then we're not going to provide that support's needed. And I tell you, as sure as night follows day, if we don't deal with the threat from Russia when it's in Ukraine, we'll be dealing with the threat from Russia when it's on our doorsteps.
Absolutely. It's such an important reminder. If the world stops paying attention, the threat doesn't just fade, it shifts direction. And we've discussed Ukraine from several angles on the podcast with absolutely phenomenal speakers. But this is the first time we're hearing you whilst you're actually there on the ground. And you've spent time in Ukraine at different stages of the war. So I'd love to ask you, how have things changed since your last visit, and what stands out most about how people are continuing to live, work, and adapt through such an extraordinary situation?
I want to start with a really positive aspect. And after nearly 4 years since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, if you come to cities like Lviv, what you need to do is picture the coolest parts of London or the coolest parts of Stockholm or the coolest parts of Sydney, and then increase it by a little bit, because I think the one thing that is just the one thing I love about humans, whether it's in Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Haiti, Sudan, is just this level of resilience. Even when humans are suffering, that level of resilience is just so inspiring. People often say to me, "I've had a career of working and living in war zones," and people always say, "Oh, that must be really tough." The answer is no. I'm always come back so motivated and so inspired, and that's the case here. Over the last week or so in Kiev and Lviv and a couple of other cities, you see the youth before the curfew kicks in. You see the young people in their late teens, early 20s out on the street. You see buskers rocking it, people dancing in the streets. There's cool, they're funky. There's a great art scene. There's museums opening up. The music, the artwork is just so much more expressive than what I've seen anywhere else. And some of the business people that I was in Kiev with this week, many of them hadn't been here before, and they made the comment that if it wasn't for the attacks overnight, which are massive and significant, but if it wasn't for those, and if it wasn't for some of the impacts from electronic warfare that we see and we experience, you wouldn't necessarily realize that Ukraine is a country at war because so many of the barricades, so many of the checkpoints, so many of the people in military uniform that were visible a year ago, 2 and 3 years ago, are now not there. The pattern of life is now much more like a cool, highly functioning, really cosmopolitan and modern city. So I think to start off with a positive is that the resilience here is just absolutely phenomenal and something to be commended. I don't know how they do it. I can't imagine if this happens in Australia how I would respond, but I hope we could respond with even just a tenth of the resilience and the braveness that the Ukrainians are approaching this with.
It's extraordinary to see that level of resilience and normal life coexisting with a full scale war. At the same time, we're watching authoritarian powers draw closer: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, among others. How is this growing cooperation changing Europe's security landscape, and what does it mean for Ukraine's ability to defend itself?
There is an increasingly coherence and authoritarian alignment. We've got countries like Russia, China with its economy and its tech, Iran with its missile and drone program, with North Korea with its munitions and missiles. Then you've got countries like South Africa and India that are funding these regimes. And this is really reshaping Europe's security environment, and it's directly degrading Ukraine's resilience. Russia and China's trade hit a record high of $244 billion. And that's such a huge level of bilateral trade between the two countries. This sanctions resilience between Russia is made possible because of countries like India, South Africa, China, Iran, and it's really just the plumbing that what Russia needs to keep its war economy going. We see the relationships between Russia and North Korea, this mutual defense treaty that was signed in about June 2024. The DPRK has been shipping large quantities of munitions, now soldiers, and we've seen some of the ballistic missiles. Some of the ballistic missiles that struck here last night were identified as the North Korean variants. So it's very, very real, these relationships. Now, of course, Russia has overrun and taken some Ukrainian cities, and sometimes when that occurs, some of the munitions that weren't able to be destroyed are sometimes seized. And we know that Russia is then on selling these to Iran. So it's just this terrible cycle. And then more broadly, as we're seeing the BRICS and the BRICS Plus expanded to Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia, of course, countries like Belarus. Whilst these aren't mutual defense pacts, they really are normalizing this anti-Western coordination and really is creating that sanctions-busting environment where Russia can get away and can sustain its attacks against not just Ukraine, but also Europe.
You've outlined how cooperation between Russia and its partners has helped keep its war economy alive. I'd love to turn to sanctions, which have become one of the main tools used to limit those networks and weaken Moscow's capacity to wage war. How effective are they today, and what do they really achieve in practice?
The situation with sanctions and the impact is really worth understanding. Russia's oil and fuel exports really is the most crucial portion of Russia's federal budget. Energy exports make up about a third of Russia's GDP and is directly funding military operations in Ukraine. Drone and missile strikes from Ukraine onto Russian refineries, onto oil export terminals, onto oil loading platforms have weakened Russia's oil industry, and it's led to lower export volumes and revenue. And this has had price fluctuations on the global market. This has been compounded by Western sanctions and tariffs imposed by countries against Russian crude. And this is applying pressure on Russia economically and politically. But Russia is adapting. It's rerouting exports. It's increasingly discounted the sales of its energy products, especially to countries like India and China, which remain key consumers of Russian energy. India and China remain the largest buyers of this discounted Russian crude oil, and this helps Russia offset the losses that have been caused by the Western market restrictions. And these recent increased sanctions by the US are welcomed. They need to be encouraged and may lead to India refineries to reduce their purchases gradually at best. So it may lead some to start reducing prices gradually. But I certainly don't think it's going to bring Russian exports to a stop. And China, whilst it's under pressure, will continue to engage significantly in energy trade with Russia because it knows that there is so many other issues that the West has to deal with when it comes to China around trades, now around critical minerals potentially being restricted on exports out of China. That when it comes to the priorities, coming back to your previous question, the West is going to prioritize those things over China's current activities with buying Russian energy. But it's the right thing. The European Union and America applying these sanctions is the right thing. Even if there are some price fluctuations in the market, there are plenty of other oil suppliers, including the US, including other OPEC members, that will even things out in the long run.
Even with those workarounds, the pressure's still there. It clearly just takes longer to show. With that, I would love to turn to technology and innovation. Hybrid warfare isn't only drones and missiles, right? It's about who adapts fastest. Do you think Europe's cautious, highly regulated approach could be slowing it down?
In summary, the short answer is yes. Europe is massively overregulated, and we must do everything we possibly can to support innovation and the business sector in order to be able to prepare Europe and in order to support Ukraine with the ongoing attacks. Now, these hybrid attacks are not just occurring in Ukraine; they're occurring right across all of Europe. We see Russian interference and covert operations across the 2024 Europe elections, the EU elections. It was systematic. Now, the EU responded and they banned additional Kremlin media and they banned some online platforms, but we didn't go far enough. And there's a lot of technology out there that could be employed and a lot of really exciting and interesting work that private sector, the businesses are doing that could be employed. Now, Europe has done a great job, and NATO is hardening. And with Finland's and Sweden's accession into NATO, that has massively improved the security of the Baltic region and coordination across the Baltic region, with NATO members committing to increase their spending from 2% of GDP up to 3.5 and 5%. That's needed and it's important. But this hybrid pressure is continuing. We see sabotage cases, arson cases, spying cases across Poland, across the UK, across Germany, across Norway, and across Sweden. I see these issues and these cases personally every single month. They're real and they happen, and they're directly attributable to Russia's activities, Russia's criminal networks, Russia's state sponsored groups. And so, European businesses and European states need to understand that this will continue and it's only going to expand. So, we need to do everything we can to support our state security services and our businesses so that we can actually work through this. Now, Europe's done a lot of good things. They've cut Russian gas supplies from about 40 to 45% of imports down to about 15% within about 2 years. So by 2023, 2024, they'd slashed dependence on Russian energy. But there's still countries, Austria's, Hungary's, Spain, that are still buying Russian energy. And that needs to stop. That needs to stop because it's funding Russia's illegal war in Ukraine and it's funding Russia's illegal activities right across Europe. The European Union has also done a great job in the Red Sea, trying to minimize disruptions on shipping and trade. And this is, of course, backed by Iran, one of Russia's main allies, but it needs to continue. Now, this is expensive, but it's also expensive to have European supply chain disrupted. So it's worth the expenditure. And then, of course, we need to keep in mind the nuclear signaling. Russia knows that European politicians are scared of the Russian nuclear saber rattling. But we need to understand this is something that Russia has always done. And to date, Russia has not utilized nuclear weapons because they understand the risk of rapid escalation. And for all of Trump's faults, the lack of predictability from Trump means that it is a wild card. So I don't think, and I feel very confident that Russia will not deploy nuclear weapons, even if European politicians are understandably scared of it. But they cannot back down every time Putin and Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Medvedev, starts rattling the nuclear saber. And the impact on Ukraine is significant. We've seen that with Russia's use of civilian drones, starting with Iranian Shaheds, but then supplemented by ballistic missiles from North Korea and dual-use technology from China. So the attacks are significant, and they attacked all parts of European and Ukrainian society.
You've just described how Russia's attacks now reach every part of Ukrainian and European life. Can you explain how Ukraine and its partners are strengthening defenses on the ground?
If we look at Ukraine directly, Katerina, Ukraine needs to lock in not just these, we see Zelensky. I don't know how he has the energy to do what he's been doing for the last few years. He's really fighting on a meal by meal basis. What we really need to do is to support Ukraine by locking in a multi-year guaranteed and reliable supply of Patriot missiles, surface to air missiles, interceptors, counter UAV layers that can go right across cities, across power plants, and be pre-positioned with spares, mobile transformers, so that Ukraine can actually defend itself. And I think Europe's talked about the drone wall that's been after. We saw again overnight that again Russia penetrated European and NATO airspace last night with zero repercussions. NATO and the EU needs to treat ground-based air defense as a continental program with common specification, joint buys. As I said before, Finland and Sweden's joining of NATO really hardens the Baltic and the Arctic air pressure, which is vital as routes across the Arctic open up. And this sort of technology is needed, and it needs to be across the continent. We need to look at things like the Czech ammunition initiative about procurement processes and guarantees to provide Ukraine with 155 and 122 millimeter artillery. We need to choke Russia's dual use lifeline. We need to really see the enforcement of the European Union's latest Russia sanctions packages, the transshipment nodes across the Caucasus, across Central Asia, across the Gulf, and these Chinese suppliers that are continuing to feed Russia with the machine tools, with the microelectronics that are being used to build the missiles and to support Russia's war effort need to be enforced. And what we need to see across both Ukraine but also across Europe is this increased physical security for logistics hubs, for businesses, for warehouses, for ports, for underwater cables, for land-based cables, and set up joint sabotage task forces with police and intelligence actions, because we know these are occurring and these aren't new. We've seen land-based and sea-based, sometimes secret telecommunications cables that have been severed. We're seeing energy infrastructure damaged. We're seeing grid defenses in Ukraine, but also across Europe. They are incredibly fragile. We can learn a lot from Ukraine about how they're protecting their energy infrastructure, but they can't do it alone. We need to look at how we can both support Ukraine and Europe with rapid repair kits. Keep in mind, when someone attacks an energy station, the transformers that we all drive past, we see them, we don't pay much attention to them, big electrical cables going into big, ugly grey boxes. Those transformers take about 5 years to replace. If one breaks, it takes about 5 years to replace it. So we need to look at what can we do with our supply chains, with our spare parts and redundancies across Europe and Ukraine to make sure that we have the redundancy that's needed. And then we need to be looking ahead. We need to look at the 2026 elections. This is a live range. This is somewhere where there's going to be takedowns, there's going to be financing plans, there's going to be significant amounts of Russian-supported talking points. We already hear them from some of our politicians. Perhaps they know, perhaps they don't know, but they're parroting Russian talking points. And this is going to increase throughout the rest of 2025 and into 2026. So we need to be countering these. We need to be educating the political class. We need to be educating the civilian population. So we need to understand that there is a very well developed and a very deliberate plan of attack, of hybrid attack against Europe. And it is real. And it's not something theoretical. It's something that I'm working with companies on every single week. And I'm seeing direct attacks against Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, and other European countries that are being attacked at least once a month that I'm seeing, that I'm personally seeing and supporting. So these are very real issues that businesses and our politicians need to be paying attention to.
A lot of what we're seeing now isn't happening on the battlefield at all. It's playing out online. And across Europe and the United States, culture wars, echo chambers are deepening divisions, and new technologies like AI are only accelerating that. I'd love to ask you, how are disinformation and these online polarization campaigns being used to shape public opinion and weaken Western support for Ukraine?
And I think the cultural war that you referred to isn't just one issue. This is a rolling contest over identity at the nation level, over ethnicity, over religion, over gender, sexuality, migration, even historical memory and facts. And I think states and people and movements are weaponizing these topics because they mobilize cheaply. We know that they polarize fast and they fracture coalitions that would otherwise have cooperated on security, on economics, on finance, on welfare, on public policy. We see fractured because of these. And we know that authoritarian states exploit this. Democracies are drowning in it, but it's being exploited by authoritarian regimes. We know that Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing aligned actors are really comfortable pushing this wedge, pushing these wedge narratives to erode trust in elections, to erode trust in refugees, in religion, in sanctions, in aid to Ukraine. And then the blowback to Western states, the blowback on democracies is really high, and it's causing divided societies. Now, the European Union has repeatedly sanctioned Russian state media for systemic manipulation because it's a strategy. It's not just sloppy journalism; it's a deliberate attempt to drive a wedge between the facts, the reality, and what we actually hear. You mentioned artificial intelligence, and I think there's a few key issues. And I think if we talk about just three of them, there's many, but if we talk about just three of them, the production cost has absolutely collapsed. The cost of actually producing generative tools, whether it's text, whether it's image, whether it's audio, makes lies cheap and fast and easy to distribute it. We saw that in 2023 in Slovakia. We saw it in Moldova and Romania recently. We will definitely see it in the upcoming US midterm elections in 2026. Audio and video deep fakes really make fact checking difficult. And it means people start believing things that aren't true. The second one is it's personalization at scale. These influence operations are mass generated, and they tailor them with the language, with the grievance, with the local cues that just seed them within communities and within closed groups. And we know that what we click on, what we follow, what we like, what we start to see more of. This is meaning that personalization of this fake information is only going to increase. And thirdly, and this is a really important one, and it's a little bit idiosyncratic, but it's about the fog, because artificial intelligence and the deep fakes that are being produced don't just fool people, but they actually teach the public that nothing is real. Now, this suppresses voter turnout, decreases and confuses a population that's about to vote in an election. And it's the crisis of knowing and unknowing, and really puts democracies at risk. And if you talked about and you asked about social platforms and social media, and the algorithms really reward outrage. They give you stuff that'll generate a reaction from you, that'll generate interaction with the platform. So it's supercharging the negativity, and it makes it much difficult for politicians and political advisors, but also business leaders, especially business leaders that are communicating, whether it's their quarterly earnings calls, whether it's communicating their company's strategy. It becomes more and more difficult. We know that Meta has repeatedly tweaked its political content recommendations. We know that the European Union out of Brussels is open formal proceedings against X, formerly Twitter, and TikTok over suspected non-compliance with EU regulations. We know that platforms like Telegram are barely moderated at all, and they really support local narratives that are often incorrect. And the overall outcome is going to be Western willpower is divided, it's confused, and honestly, it's exhausted because of all the competing narratives. And this is where our politicians, this is where our business leaders need to be really clear on their messaging. They cannot stay silent. They need to be clear, coherent, fact based, and understand the implications of what they're saying, and then monitoring how the environment is responding to what they're saying.
Let's dig a little bit deeper. Building on what you've said, could Ukraine's success or failure now determine not just the outcome of the war, but the future shape of Western security cooperation itself? We're already seeing visible tension between Washington and Brussels and even within NATO. Does that risk emboldening Russia's hybrid strategy?
Now we're seeing more and more information being leaked from the recent meeting between Zelensky and Donald Trump in the White House. We all know that Putin did an emergency call with Trump just before Zelensky landed. That alone should have been a really key warning flag to the Trump administration, but everyone else, that Putin was worried, Putin was panicked. But as has often been the case, Putin succeeded. And by the time Zelensky landed, Trump just simply wasn't interested in engaging on the topic. Apparently, he was tossing maps around the room. He was saying to Zelensky, I don't even know some of these cities. I've never heard of these cities. These cities don't matter, which is just heartbreaking. These are cities where people are living and dying under Russian attacks. But the impact, if Ukraine doesn't succeed in its war against Russia, or its defense against Russia's war on it, is huge. We know that there is collaboration and cooperation between China and Russia. We're all aware of, and there's been some fantastic episodes on the podcast. I really encourage our listeners to go back and listen to some of our episodes. Audrey Wong is one, but there's been several we've done recently about China and China's activities in the Indo-Pacific region. But China is not going to operate alone. China will work in collaboration with Iran and with Russia to make sure that NATO and Europe is busy and that America is busy. So there's just so many different factors, whether it's China's interest in Taiwan, whether it's the war in Ukraine, but this will directly affect NATO and Europe's deterrence capability, the alliance credibility. It'll maintain and strengthens the doctrine that Russia has about threatening its neighbors. We'll see authoritarian governments feel strengthened and emboldened to take further action. I mean, we thought, if we look at Africa, we thought that the era of coups was over. We thought that ended in the 90s, but we've seen 9 coups over the last couple of years. Funnily enough, all supported by Russia and Russian mercenaries, former the Wagner Group, but now other Russian groups. We'll see authoritarian states and an increasing amount of coups occur. And we're going to see this hybrid pressure escalating. And I just cannot emphasize strongly enough the significant risk that hybrid warfare and attacks on critical infrastructure, the penetration of Russian and anti-Western sympathies within companies is going to be. And we're going to see this headwind against democracy. We know that for the last 20 years, every single year, on different grades of the level of democracy and democratic health around the world has declined. And that's only going to continue. And that's not good for our listeners. It's not good for business. And it's something that we need to be aware of, and we need to be standing up. We need to be voting. We need to be supporting the political class. And we need to accept that this is going to result in higher defense bills. I'm a citizen of Europe. I live in Europe, and I want money spent on schools. I want money spent on hospitals. I want money spent on roadworks and parks. But I have to accept, and I do accept, that there's going to be higher defense bills. Otherwise, all those things are going to go out. And there's going to be much greater kinetic and cyber activity on European soil. And that means on the ground in London, Oslo, Stockholm, Copenhagen, in Krakow, Warsaw, Berlin. There's going to be more direct activity. So we need to support Ukraine. We need to make sure that Russia's activities are not rewarded, they're punished, and they're prevented from expanding even further into mainland Europe.
You've talked about hybrid warfare targeting infrastructure and supply chains. When you look at Europe's recent experience, what kinds of cyber and sabotage threats are companies and governments facing, and how prepared are they to respond?
It's really important. And for anyone that thinks that their company has done enough when it comes to cybersecurity, that should be a red flag. If you think, yeah, we've done enough, that's a red flag. Anyone that knows the team at Jaguar Land Rover knows that they had a very strong information security and IT security team. A very large team. But car production, as a result of a cyber attack on Jaguar Land Rover, meant that the entire UK's car production dropped 27%. There were hundreds of suppliers that were impacted. And keep in mind, this is the UK's largest car maker, has had to stop making vehicles for more than 5 weeks. So ask yourself, is your IT team as strong as Jaguar Land Rovers? It's probably not. And what would happen to your business if you had to stop work for 5 weeks because of a cyber attack? Now, ultimately, the UK government stepped in and promised £1.5 billion in emergency loans to help Jaguar through this. You have to ask yourself again, would your government step in with £1.5 billion or the equivalent of to support your company if you're impacted by a cyber crime? And again, in most cases, the answer is probably no. And we know that the cyber attacks and hybrid attacks more broadly across Europe, most of them are directly attributable to Russian origin. And it looks like drone incursions, it looks like cyber attacks, it looks like disinformation campaigns, it looks like sabotage efforts. It's targeting energy, critical infrastructure, it's targeting public morale. And as you said, Russia is also looking at the space domain. As of early September 2025, there's been multiple Russian drone incursions across Europe in Poland, Romania, Estonia. Denmark, Norway, Germany, Belgium, Sweden have all suffered from drone or military aircraft incursions into their territory. Now, mostly unarmed reconnaissance or decoys, this has still caused airport closures. It's caused disruptions to flights. As you said before, there's been GPS spoofing across the Baltic. NATO and the European Union is interpreting these aerial intrusions as a test, which is correct because that's exactly what it is. It's also an attempt to destabilize Europe, which it is. And this is also distracting attention and pulling attention away from important issues like Russia's desire to build weapons that can be used in space. Now, that would have devastating impacts on so many different sectors. We know that European leaders, like the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, has publicly termed all of these attacks as hybrid warfare. And she's talked about this unified and deterrent response that both governments and the public and the private sector businesses need to step up. Now, NATO is ramping up its preparedness, but we need to understand that even some of the most largest and successful companies like Germany are struggling, and it's going to take them years, if not decades, to turn their defense forces, their intelligence, and their anti-hybrid warfare operations into something successful. And so this is where the business sector, which is much more agile, needs to be able to defend and respond by itself. Now, we know that many countries, including Poland, including Denmark, I believe also Finland and Estonia, have arrested people involved in Russian-sponsored crime and sabotage activities across their nations and across the Baltic Sea. But this is really blurring that line between kinetic conflict and asymmetric actions.
Over the past few years, we've seen businesses pouring a huge amount of money into cybersecurity and data protection. I'd love to ask you, how seriously are companies taking this now? And are those investments actually making them more resilient?
It's something that most companies have spent a lot of money on lately, and anyone working in tech will know that there's been the company's internal and subcontracted information security and IT security and data security teams are larger now than what they've ever been before, and that's the right move to be taken. But I think it is an evolving landscape. It is something that needs to be taken very, very seriously, and any company that thinks that they've got it all solved is probably not. But what I would say is that companies, if we look at a three-legged stool, you've got your information security, you've got your physical security, and you've got your personnel security. That's where there's going to be leaks from. That's where there's going to be either information leaked to nation states, information leaked to competitors, or advantage taken by organized criminal groups. As I said, most companies are doing a lot now in information security. Physical security is kind of there or it isn't. You've either got strong policies on printing documents, on fences, access cards, locked doors, etc. That's generally either you've got it or you don't. But in that third leg, which is personnel security, how are you attracting personnel? What sort of screening do you do when you are recruiting personnel? How do you onboard personnel, and what does that look like? Do you just get them to do a 3 minute online video or questionnaire about IT security and think you're done? And then how do you maintain security during an employee's life cycle? And then when it's time to offboard an employee when they leave, what sort of precautions are taken then? I see very few companies taking that seriously in Europe. In North America, there's a lot being done to monitor and track and support employees and employers and companies during an employee's life cycle. But in Europe, we're a long way behind because of our desire to strengthen privacy, which is a good thing. But we don't necessarily do robust checks enough on employees, and we don't repeat those checks. We do them once. Now, you think about your life, Katerina. Where you lived 10 years ago, who you were dating 10 years ago, where you were spending your money 10 years ago. That's probably very different from what you're doing today. And yet, if you worked at a company for 10 years, apparently that background check they did on you 10 years ago was enough, even though all those things in your life have changed 10 years later. So, repeating background checks is critical, but also how we're monitoring, supporting, mentoring our employees throughout their life cycle and what we're doing to support managers. Are we teaching our managers this is what to look for in your employees? And I don't mean spying on our employees. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking how do we support employees? An employee going through a divorce, an employee with some sort of substance abuse, an employee with some sort of additional pressure. And it could be a sick child, it could be a child with a learning difficulty. All those things add pressure on our employees. Now, it doesn't mean they're going to steal your data, but it may mean they're more careless with their passwords or they're more careless with their laptop because they've got that additional pressure. But in some cases, if there's things like substance abuse, if they've met new people who might be involved in organized crime, even if they're not aware of, those things will be taken advantage of. And again, I'm not just talking in theories. These are issues that I'm dealing with. I've had a call this morning. I've got one after this recording with different companies that have got problems with insider threats where their employees, previously good employees, and now probably responsible for data leakage to competitors and to organized crime. So these are very real issues. So I'd say, yeah, to go back to your question, companies are probably doing a lot when it comes to data security and information security, but they probably need to do more when they consider insider threats.
We've talked a lot about resilience and security on a national level, but I want to bring it back to the corporate world. What can companies learn from Ukraine's experience about crisis preparation and communication when everything can change overnight?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And we don't have to be in all out war to consider how we're preparing for crisis. As we all saw at the Coldplay concert, even a company that's rocking along well with a really good CEO or apparently really good CEO and a good executive team in just 30 seconds can go into crisis. Now, that company managed to navigate the crisis and with the help of people like Gwyneth Paltrow, managed to really navigate that crisis quite well and come out largely unscathed. But that's not always the case. And companies need practice crisis communications and practice crisis management plans. And the more you're preparing, the better you'll be when, not if, but when crises occur. I do a lot of crisis preparedness work with companies across Europe, and I'm sad to say that they're continually being tested. But the companies that are investing in crisis management, when the crisis occur, it's not a huge issue. They're normally able to navigate it. Now, usually they still call in external advisors like me to support and mentor and go through the process. But they've practiced it so many times when crisis does strike, they're able to get through it. And there's a lot of lessons we can learn from countries that are at war at the most extreme ends, like Ukraine. And they're considering how do they communicate with their employees? How do they communicate with their subcontractors when they're continually suffering from cyber attacks? What is the best way and what does good leadership look like for a corporate entity when your employees are under stress? Now, it could be under stress because Russia's bombs Kiev overnight, or it could be under stress because of COVID, or your employees could be stressed because of a restructure. Whatever the issue is, we can learn some of these lessons about communication, about crisis preparedness, and about how good executive teams lead during crisis and during times of increased stress.
We've spoken a lot about crisis management and leadership under pressure, but I'd like to go deeper into the structure behind it. What practices, things like distributed decision making, redundancy, or fast feedback loops can global companies adopt from Ukraine's business community? And more broadly, what's the single most important lesson Ukrainian companies offer to leaders navigating volatility today?
I think it's really, really valid. There's the Edelman Trust Barometer, and it's been around for a long time. I think it's been around for a couple of decades now, and that talks about how much trust the civilian population has with corporates, with corporate leadership. And the last survey, the 2025 survey, resulted in a finding of, I think it was 61% of people hold a moderate to high grievance against corporate institutions. So 61% of people don't trust corporate institutions. They have skepticism towards corporate motivations. They believe that business leaders mislead the public. And that's obviously huge. This pervasive mistrust challenges companies to not only achieve economic outcomes, but also consider the social and ethical expectations that the community has on them. And I think this trust deficit also affects internal collaboration. We talk about employee engagement, leadership credibility, risk tolerance from leaders and from employees. And I think, companies face a lot of challenges, from external challenges from consumers, partners, regulators. They've got to be transparent. They've got to be ethical. They've got to be accountable. But this trust gap, really exacerbates that further. And so I think this is a really important thing, and I'm glad you asked the question. And when we consider what we can learn from Ukrainian companies, I think it's about genuine, authentic leadership. It's not about knowing everything, but it's about being honest and transparent with your employees. I'm currently working in Sweden, or today I'm working in Ukraine, but I live and work in Sweden. And one thing that I think is really common, and it's partly a cultural thing across Scandinavian countries, but it's this timid form of leadership. It's not addressing things head on, and it often results in a lack of transparency. A Swedish or Norwegian business leader or manager will never sit down with an employee and go, "Look, I really appreciate you, Katerina, but you need to work on 1, 2, and 3." It'll never come out like that. That's way too direct. But when it comes to talking about organizational priorities and processes and transformations, there's equally a lack of transparency. And I think that's one thing that Ukrainian business leaders have done really well. They're not all of them are the best business leaders in the world. Some are fantastic, some are good, and some are poor. But one thing they've all learned really quickly over the last few years is they have to be honest with their employees. They have to be transparent, and they have to be open about where their strengths and where their weaknesses are. Because ultimately, I'll let you in on a little secret, employees know where their managers suck. The managers think they're hiding it, but they're not. Employees see it. So we're better off just being transparent and open and honest. This is where we're going. This is what we're doing. There's some decisions we're still mulling over, but this is what the plan is today. And I think that's something we should all learn from Ukrainian business leaders, the importance of honest and transparent leadership.
Dominic, before we finish, I'd love to thank our audience for following these conversations. We would love it if you sent in your ideas about what matters most to you. And we always want to make sure that the topics we cover reflect the issues that feel urgent to our listeners. So please do keep sharing your thoughts and suggestions with us. And Dominic, as we wrap up, what questions would you like to leave our audience with, something that they can think about as they prepare for the months ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Katerina. And I think just to build on that, but I think you said it quite well yourself. And the team are really just, we're continually like sort of, trying to really pull apart what are the topics that matter most to our audience, what matters most. And we know what matters most when we hear from you. So please do not only subscribe to our audio podcasts on iTunes and Spotify, but also our content on YouTube. We really appreciate you following and subscribing to that content. But also, we want to hear your comments. So please comment on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, but also feel free to email us, contact@theinternationalriskpodcast.com. Send us your questions. Send us the topics that you're interested in. We read your comments and we take those into account. So please do reach out to us and let us know what your comments are and what your thoughts are on the content, because we produce this for you. So if there's something that we can do better, or there's topics you want to hear more or less of, please let us know. And if I was to leave our listeners with one question, Katerina, it would probably be if you look back in 6 months' time at one thing you could have done better today to prepare for what is a really volatile and an unstable environment that we're all working and living in. What is that one topic that you think you could look back and wish you'd done more on? And then maybe ask yourself, why haven't you done more on it? Because ultimately, that's what's going to matter. So that would be the question that I'd leave our listeners with. What's one thing in 6 months' time that you wish you'd paid a bit more attention to? Thanks very much for the questions today, Katerina. I really loved your questions. I think this was a really fun conversation. I look forward to doing this again in the near future. I hope our listeners found the conversation around Russia's war in Ukraine, around what this means for businesses working in Europe and North America, and what companies can do to provide better leadership to their communities and to their employees. But thanks very much for listening to the International Risk Podcast. We look forward to speaking to you again in the next couple of days. Please stay tuned for more.